Thank you. It is an absolute pleasure to be here this afternoon. I want to thank Hazel for the gracious invitation to actually come and talk about some of the work that I've been doing and some of the issues that I've been addressing within and without of architecture. And it's also fantastic to both hear from, address, and converse with the Ecuadorian delegation about issues that are not only of concern to Ecuador and the region, but also clearly the United States and globally. And so part of what I'm going to talk about, because I, unlike David, I do not know Ecuador well, but I actually will be talking somewhat about the US, but actually talking a lot about how we start to understand our built environment globally. Architecture is somewhat of a backwater, and there is, particularly within the profession, a lot of the discussions that are sort of that we're having this morning and in this room have not yet quite made their way into architecture. And so part of what the project WBYA attempts to do, Who Builds Your Architecture, is to begin to try to raise these questions within the field to begin to make architects practice in a much more socially conscious way. It's working, perfect. Amazing, fantastic, bravo, and wow, exclaim viewers of this YouTube video that documents the 9-year-long process of constructing One World Trade Center in downtown Manhattan by compressing into 1 minute and 58 spectacular seconds. Roads appear magically, cranes quiver like reeds in the wind. The steel structural frame and central core rise majestically as the building skin zips up the exterior like a banana peeling in reverse. This is the alchemical vision of 21st century construction. A rapt global audience can tune in to watch skyscrapers, stadia, high-rise housing, museums, and shopping malls sprout like mushrooms after a hard rain along the skylines of Manhattan, but also London, San Francisco, Beijing, Seoul, Moscow, Rio de Janeiro, Cairo, Abu Dhabi, Doha, and so on. The producer of this video, EarthCam, released it earlier in the month on September 11th. 12 years after the destruction of the World Trade Center. Recorded by 35 cameras perched around the canyon of the building site and located as far away as New Jersey, the commemorative video, which also served as a well-placed infomercial for the high-tech potential of webcam capabilities, highlights, as the boosterism of EarthCam's press release proclaims, quote, the rebirth and the continuous progression of American ingenuity at the World Trade Center site. Indeed, global surveillance technologies that can be viewed from EarthCam's satellite and up close via its apps facilitate the monitoring of assets and logistics by a transnational roster of engineering, architecture and construction companies, corporations of all types, media conglomerates, governmental agencies, tourist destinations, police, and military organizations. But what goes unseen in these popular time-lapse videos are the very workers whose physical labor is still critical for the erection of these buildings. In other words, why don't we know who is building your architecture? Because it combines aesthetics with the pragmatics of functionality, we look to architecture for what it can do. Buildings, after all, house people. They provide shelter for dwelling, for work, for leisure. Along with food and drink, that is sustenance, one of our fundamental needs is to have shelter. Whether designed by architects or not, which most are not, buildings are ubiquitous. The movement within the architectural profession that has prompted architects in their design practices to join community activists, critics, curators, municipalities, and NGOs to lead the charge in addressing urgent social needs around the world is a welcome development, and one that need only expand its scope. But beyond solving the basic challenge of providing shelter, we must keep in mind that buildings are not only things, but productions, assemblages. Beyond the exuberant forms and debates about aesthetics, the building of architecture initiates a constellation of sociocultural, political, juridical, and economic actions. The mutually dependent and subsequently toxic relationship between construction industries, financial markets, and states made itself evident in 2007 when national economies, like dominoes, were torpedoed by the global debt crisis, or as Denise Ferrara da Silva and Paula Chakravarti have perceptively relabeled it as the subprime crisis, precisely because it exacted profits from places and persons produced as unsuitable economic subjects, end quote, who had already been marked by, quote, the post-colonial apparatus of raciality. And that fits in, I think, with a lot of what was being discussed in the first panel, and also some of the points I think that David just raised. So in Spain, for example, the woes and reckless behavior of the country's flagship construction industry, one that made projects like Sevilla's fanciful Metropol Parasol possible, has littered the countryside with derelict housing estates and other abandoned projects. And the socialization of loss by the banks and the building industry is being paid for by rightly outraged working public, los indignados, who must bear the brunt of the unjust force of austerity measures. Now, one might argue that unlike many of the everyday objects we use that are sourced and produced in all corners of the globe, buildings are local, literally moored into place by their weighty foundations. Even though buildings are static, the production of building nonetheless depends on conduits of global capital that are underwritten by neoliberal economic policies and facilitated by the physical spaces and pathways channeling the movement of raw materials, building supplies, waste. This is exactly the environmental degradation I think David was referring to. But also you find architects and engineers and construction workers, project managers, owners, and investors to building sites all around the world. Like the abuses within the clothing industry where women, many of them teenagers, label in untenable conditions inside Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Honduran, and Chinese sweatshops, and also replicating the mistreatment of legions of workers employed by electronic behemoths like Foxconn in China, contracted by Apple and Cupertino, the production of architecture shares many of the same problems of labor exploitation. Even though he was determined throughout his career to advance the medieval practices of building into the industrial age, high modernist architect and god of the detail, Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, once remarked that, quote, architecture starts when you put two bricks together. There it begins, end quote. So the critical question I want to pose around the panel's theme of sustainability and environmental justice is, who lays the brick and who is building your architecture? Now, over the past few years, Human Rights Watch has systematically released a series of reports on the exploitation of migrant workers at job sites for skyscrapers in Beijing, at the 2014 Sochi Olympic sites in Russia, and the large development projects in the United Arab Emirates. Human Rights Watch has also meticulously documented the particularly egregious exploitation and abuse of migrant construction workers on Abu Dhabi's Saadiyat Island, where the parametrically configured volumes of the new Louvre and Guggenheim museums, along with NYU's state-of-the-art green campus, will soon rise from the desert's sands. The abuse of Saadiyat Island's construction workers, some of you may know, sparked an ongoing boycott of the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi by a cadre of artists, scholars, and activists who are the Gulf Labor Coalition. And their sort of theme is who is building the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi. And so what was interesting within that debate was the fact that there were no architects responding to what they were asking. So HRW's reports not only document the harrowing working conditions under the unrelenting desert heat that workers must routinely endure, but their reporting also exposes how a network of subcontractors and labor recruiters lure men from Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nepal, the Philippines, and elsewhere with the prospects of lucrative pay. And this is also true for domestic workers. So this isn't the only, construction isn't the only industry where these flows of migrant workers are problematic. Once arrived, the promise of employ never materializes. For example, they're often promised a waiting job in a hotel. And instead, they are herded to construction sites to actually build a hotel, where the pay is far less than promised, and accommodations are no more than a cramped, unsanitary barracks. Because these massive construction projects are often under the purview of parastatal construction entities, themselves tethered to authoritarian states where migrants have no rights, abused workers cannot strike or protest their mistreatment. What's more, neither can they leave, since their passports may have been confiscated. And even worse, they and their families are indebted thousands of dollars to unscrupulous recruiters. Another chilling, oops, that's why I wanted to sound off, sorry about that. Another chilling example of the exploitation of migrant construction workers is currently unfolding at the FIFA sites under construction in Qatar. The city, which will host the 2022 World Cup, where star architects like Zaha Hadid and Albert Speer Jr., yes, the son of Hitler's architect, have partnered with the transnational building company AECOM to craft an aqueous fantasy land in the desert peninsula. Now, it should be no surprise that AECOM would have its hand in the till, since it operates the biggest architectural engineering consortium in the world, one whose divisions specialize in mining and oil extraction. The question is, are they in Ecuador? I would suspect they have been. They also deal with military logistics and national security. They also offer international development with an emphasis on helping governments craft democratic frameworks. Egypt, for example, is or perhaps was one of their clients. I suppose always keen on landing a diversity hire in the not so diverse fields of architecture and engineering, AECOM's technology division apparently awarded an internship to Qamis Gaddafi in the months before his nefarious father was overthrown. So on these sprawling sites in Doha, as yesterday's Guardian newspaper reported, the conditions are harsh and dangerous at work, and the living conditions are cramped and squalid. In this unforgiving environment, these are Nepalese, Indian, and Sri Lankan migrant workers who are being killed at an alarming rate. The International Trade Union Confederation, in this extraordinary article, estimates that death tolls could reach up to 12 per week out of what is currently in Qatar 1.2 million workforce of migrant workers, and it is growing. Is this the fate of those who build your architecture? In the competition to secure lucrative contracts to erect these multi-billion-dollar FIFA stadia, the winning team of architects and engineers' primary concern was to deploy the most advanced technology to fashion climatically comfortable environments for both the soccer player on the field and the soccer fans in the bleachers, who will have to contend with temperatures that may exceed 110 degrees. But no mention was made of the workers who are going to be there building these structures. Now, as Arup Associates' website asserts, a carbon zero stadia, which will actually be a sustainability benchmark, would help position Qatar as, quote, a progressive, forward-thinking nation, end quote. So to sustain, we must remember, is to support, uphold, and endure. The logics and ethics of sustainability movement focuses our collective actions as consumers and producers in order to maintain life and preserve the environment that supports us all. The Green Building Initiative, concerned with the ethics of constructing environmentally sensitive buildings that provide an ecologically sound environment for owners and inhabitants, has had a fundamental impact on how architects build buildings over the past 40 years. The nonprofit US Green Council's what's called Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design, you may hear architects or even building owners, and probably on this campus referred to as LEED buildings, has made the design, construction, and operation and maintenance of buildings compliant with stipulations for low energy use and environmental impact. But not only should these criteria impact the client in use, but LEED practices and inclusion of sustainability has worked its way into the ethics of the AIA's Code of Conduct. These practices link what architects do with the complex relationships between users and owners, and energies and materials, climate and site conditions. But one of the fundamental problems with how LEED operates is that architects must pay for their professional licensure as LEEDs, and clients must pay a non-governmental entity to validate that a building has been built with sustainable materials. Once again, capitalism has marketized what should be universal practices of building wisely and ethically. And so this is one of the questions that I have within Ecuador, particularly from indigenous people. Are there practices that are being adopted into building practices within Ecuador that recognize that it's not about the monetization of these practices, but that they should just be done? But what more can be done? Drawing on inspiration from green building movement, a young writer and designer, Anna Louis, has made the compelling argument that, quote, worker rights and safety should be a pivotal point for any sustainability discussion. The environment is not just the air, ground, and water, but people with whom we work and live, end quote. With architects building globally, often disconnected from their own political context, what is their responsibility toward the workers who construct their buildings? Our advocacy project, Who Builds Your Architecture, asks, should the production of buildings also sustain the human lives of those who build this architecture? And keep in mind, these issues do not just transpire abroad, but take place in our own backyard. So I want to conclude by taking measure of the sum of our actions. Sumak Kawsay invites us to engage in a sustainable and just practice of good living, one that should behoove the profession of architecture to adapt as part of their ethics of practice. Perhaps under the ethos, the haves, or as George W. Bush once winked at his constituency, the have-mores, could do with a lot less of the good life, so that more people can sustain a good living. Thank you.